My friends, good day. It's more terrible than we thought. I'll tell you about it. You notice around me that the environment has changed, the palm trees, the birds, all that. I've moved from the United Kingdom to Mauritius. My future videos will be filmed in Mauritius. If you want to discuss a personal, professional, or immigration-related project, my calendar is in the video description and the pinned comment. Air India 161 crashed a month ago. Today we know more because a preliminary report has been released, made public by the Indian authorities. So a preliminary report, to be clear, is not a report that will try to piece things together. It's not a report that will try to provide hypotheses or explanations. It's a report that will present facts. What do we know at this stage? I have to say, unfortunately, we already know almost enough. So the plane was supposed to go to Gatwick from Ahmedabad, supposed to go to Gatwick in the United Kingdom. And actually, it's a Boeing 787 leaving the terminal. It leaves the terminal, reaches the runway, goes up to the end, to the turnaround area where the runway is wider, turns around and lines up. I want to emphasize this point because at the time there were theories in the media that the plane used only part of the runway, the 1,900 meters instead of 3,505 meters. We now know that it used the entire runway. It's the co-pilot who's flying this leg, which means the co-pilot is at the controls and the captain on his left is the monitoring pilot. At this stage, the report does not say whether there is or isn't a third person in the cockpit. Nothing is mentioned. We'll see that later. Now the plane is properly configured for takeoff. The flaps are set to 5, which is typical for Boeing 787 takeoffs, even though other settings are possible. But typically it's 5 degrees. I'm emphasizing this point because at the time, some American channels in particular said that they tried to take off without the flaps. It was a hypothesis which can be possible generally speaking, but on an aircraft as modern as the 787, it's borderline, even far-fetched. And it was picked up by the media who spread it. Today we have a photo of the flap lever set to 5. It's on notch 5. Even though it's burned, we can see that the flaps were indeed extended. On top of that, we have images of the destroyed wings, and we can see that the flaps were also extended. The plane starts to accelerate. It accelerates, it accelerates, it accelerates. It's heavy, it's hot, so it's going to use up a lot of runway. That's normal. Then we reach the decision speed, V1, which is announced. The co-pilot, as per procedure, takes his hand off the throttle controls. He holds the control stick with both hands. The rotation speed comes just 1 or 2 seconds later. He starts pulling back on the stick. To make the plane take off, the landing gear leaves the ground. And now we have time to count to 3. 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. And then bam, bam. There is one hand someone who is going to stop both engines one after the other. There are two big switches located on the central console below the throttle lever. In reality, they will be operated manually, 1 second apart. It goes click, click. They're switches, we can describe them, they're bistable switches. They're stable in the open position and in the closed position. But between the two positions, there's a roller with a spring that's inside the mechanism. You have to pull them afterward to move the roller. So you need a fairly firm action, a determined gesture. You can't activate them by mistake or while searching for something else. It requires deliberate action. No, they're heavy, they're solid. There's a spring that keeps them from moving easily. So they've been stopped. This switch is cut off the fuel supply to the engines, so they shut off the flow. And at that moment, the plane loses thrust, so it's going to pitch up. It reached 8 degrees, it reached 180 knots, and that's the maximum speed it's going to reach. And from that point on, it will start to lose speed and altitude. Inside the cockpit, one says to the other, presumably the co-pilot, who says to the other, who says to the... Because the report doesn't say who says to the captain, why did you cut them off? Who replies, it wasn't me. So it's a pretty crazy situation, but it's very hard to know why what motivation someone could have to do something like that during takeoff. I can just tell you without making any assumptions that if I'm on a plane, whether it's big or small, it could be a Cessna 172, and you grab the red mixture lever and you bring it back to 0 during takeoff. If I do that in a plane during takeoff, once it's left the ground, I expect the engine or engines to stop. I expect the plane to come back down to the ground with a lot of force. And I expect if there are obstacles, I expect to hit them and I expect to die. So that's pretty much what I can tell you at this point. The plane did actually start coming back down to the ground. Technically, what's going to happen is that the ram air turbine is going to rupture. There's a picture that was from another angle that was included in the report. It's hard to see. The ram air turbine isn't very big. It is rupturing. It's a small propeller that will be driven by the relative wind, and it will generate hydraulics. It will generate hydraulic pressure for vital systems. That means the flight controls, nothing else. So the ram air turbine will spin. And at the same time, we have the auxiliary power unit, which detects that there are no more engines, which detects that we've lost power. In this case, it's at 0, as we say, at 0 VFSG. And what the auxiliary power unit will do is start its startup sequence. This channel was the only one, the first one, whether in English, French, or any other language, to announce it to you. That means when we looked in the debris, there was something, this was the auxiliary power unit hatch that was open. Now, this hatch has a mechanism that prevents it from opening or closing on impact. It has a system. It opens to allow air to enter and go to the auxiliary power unit. It's a small turbine located at the very back of the plane, which is a VFSG, and it provides electricity. The plane crashed before the system could start up, as it takes 1 minute and 40 seconds to initialize at the virtual moment, right, when it would have finished its startup cycle. So, what's happening in the cockpit? We have 12 seconds, 10 to 12 seconds after these switches are closed. They switch to the open position. That means someone is going to switch them to the open position. So, what's surprising, and the report doesn't say anything about that, but they probably left something out. It's why does it take them 12 seconds to put them back? Why? So if they did not identify the problem, let's say someone stopped them without the pilots knowing, and the pilots didn't realize, and they took all that time to see that the switches were off. There we can understand it took them some time to investigate. When the switches are turned off, one pilot asked the other, "Why did you do that?" So that means it was identified right away. But if we identified it right away, why did it take 12 seconds to turn them back on? It doesn't make any sense. So something happened during that interval. The one who had them, for example, potentially the one who stopped them, prevented the other from opening them. Or again, something of that nature, right? So now once they're open, here's technically what will happen. It's that we have in the engines, we have what we call full authority digital engine control. These are electronic systems which manage the engine when they sense that we've put the fuel back in. The full authority digital engine control itself doesn't really know. It doesn't know the position, it doesn't know the plane, it doesn't know what the plane is doing and all that. It only knows the engine. The FADEC monitors the engine's rotation speed, because a jet engine it's not like a diesel or gasoline engine that stops in a split second. You turn the key, you cut the fuel, and it goes click, and it stops immediately. No, that's not how it works. It's running at full power, so it's spinning very fast. When we cut off its fuel, it won't slow down right away. It'll keep spinning very fast. Of course, it's losing speed. Also, keep in mind that the plane isn't stopped, it's not on the ground, the plane itself is moving at a certain speed. The relative airflow will help keep the engine spinning slightly, slowing their deceleration, but not stopping them from slowing down. So here's what will happen. When the switches are turned back on, one of the engines, its N2 assembly, what we call the high pressure assembly, is made up of high pressure compressors and turbines. It spins fast enough to fall within the full authority digital engine control regulation curve. And the full authority digital engine control decides to start injecting fuel into it, and the speed of this one, so of this N2 assembly, starts to increase. So we had an engine that was in the process of starting up. The other engine, well, the speed of the engine's core had dropped too low, and so it was no longer possible to restart it. Even if the switch comes on, the full authority digital engine control can't restart it, despite all that. So even though we turned the switch back on, the engine was in the process of shutting down. To restart it, we would have had to wait for the auxiliary power unit to come on, which provides electricity to power the VFSG, we have 2 VFSG per engine. There are 2 in the auxiliary power unit, which are a kind of electric generators slash starters. We could say they're electric engines. When you drive them with the engine, they provide you with electricity. When you supply them with electricity, they spin. So they're the ones that drive the engine during startup. Once it starts, well, it begins to drive them itself, and they become generators. There are 2 per engine. Only one is enough to start the engine, but it will be slow. In this specific case, once the engine stops, there's no way to restart it unless you have in flight, if you don't have the auxiliary power unit, or you can restart it by windmilling, but you need a lot more speed. I don't have the document in front of me. Windmilling means starting them with the relative wind, except I doubt that at the speeds reached by this plane, there was enough air to do windmilling. But in any case, one of the engines wasn't sufficiently shut down, in quotes, and so it was in the process of restarting on its own. So one thing, don't try this at home, of course, but I'll tell you why this 12-second delay is essential to understand here. It's because imagine, I'm just saying, imagine, don't do it. You take off with a 787. Once it leaves the ground, you take the switch. Click, you turn it off, and half a second later, you turn it back on. You have a shot. Why? Because just like the engine, we cut off its fuel, but it's still spinning at high speed. Once we flip the switch back on, what the full authority digital engine control will do, it sees that the speed is high, it will start injecting fuel, and the engine will restart. That's what almost happened with the 787, except that the Air India 171, except for the timing, the time that passed, 12 seconds, the time that passed, well, it meant it was too late for one of the engines. Its speed had dropped low enough that it needed a lot of time to come back. And so they didn't have that time. They crashed, as I said, with an 8-degree pitch up. It was the tail that hit first. So the tail section, the part where the tailplane is, the tail cone was torn off, and so the aircraft was destroyed by the building. It scattered across the roof of the building and the surrounding area with a big fire and everything. For your information, the fuel was analyzed. There was no problem. There was no fuel issue. It was analyzed at the pumps. It was analyzed on the airport's distribution system. I'm not talking about the plane. The fuel that was on the plane mostly burned up. A laboratory is currently analyzing the few crumbs or drops that may have been recovered, providing a potential lead. I think we can rule that out at this stage because we know that someone manually shut down its engines. So, as I mentioned at the start, it's much more terrible than we initially believed, my friends. The theory of the pilot who causes the accident on purpose is a theory that is never addressed on this channel, at least initially. Always in retrospect, and with elements that justify it. The reason is that from an epistemological point of view, it's a theory that is completely empty. It has no epistemological content. The reason is that it applies to any accident. You can take almost any accident on this channel and bring up the theory that the pilot did it on purpose, because it applies to all situations. Well, it doesn't really have any value unless we have solid reasons that in this particular case it could apply. There you go, my friends. Thank you for listening to this video up to this point. You have, let me remind you, the calendar is open. If you need to talk to me, you book and we talk. I'll see you in the next video. And then see you soon.